Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 88th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. We've had 87 before, and never before have we had one on bowling. And so we have our first talk on bowling, and not any old bowling, but 9-pin bowling. So we're delighted that we're going to have a talk today by Anna Katharina Pikos. But before that, a few administrative notices. The first one, I'm going to hand over to Thomas Peters about a conference in Rotterdam.
Yes, thank you, James. So a little publicity here. I hope you can see my screen.
Yep.
We have a workshop every year. Normally, we haven't had one last year due to Corona. We were lucky enough to just be before the lockdown started in 2020, but we're back. So on the 13th of May, in Rotterdam, the idea of this workshop is to have 5 seminars in a row, really. And to kick it off, we have lunch, and at the end, we have dinner. So participation is €50. If you want to come along, send us an email. Our address is sportecon@ese.eur.nl, and we will no doubt spam you through other channels as well with this program and with our workshop. So this is a first heads up. So thank you, James.
Thank you, Thomas. I certainly hope to be in attendance at that event. One of my favourite places to go. So hopefully I can make that. In other conference-related information, you will be aware that the 16th Gijón Conference on Sports Economics is in memory of Stefan Kazan on May the 6th and 7th, and the deadline for abstracts is April the 10th. So you've still got a little while for that, but do mark that in your diaries. The 16th Gijón Sport Economics Conference. And another date for the diary is the ESEA, so the European Sports Economic Association Conference in Helsinki, 24th, 26th of August. And again, I can't find it to hand, but the abstract deadline is fairly soon, but that's in Helsinki. And also here in Reading in July 11th to the 13th, we will be hosting the 9th Math Sport International Conference. There will be a website coming up imminently, but please do also look out for that, and please do consider submitting and even coming to Reading itself. Many of you perhaps have never been to the delightful place that is Reading, and so please do give that some consideration, and more details will follow in due course. But I don't want to hold up Anna any longer. Anna's happy to take questions for clarification as she goes along, and she's presenting different but stable gender-specific competitive behaviour across age. So all yours, Anna. Katharina.
Thank you. We changed the title a bit, but I don't think it really makes a big difference. So it's now different but stable and performance against the opposite gender across age. So let me briefly arrange my screens. So first of all, also from me, a general thank you for this really cool opportunity and organizing this throughout the pandemic, kind of to keep in touch. I really enjoyed many talks, although not in person, but mostly on YouTube. So today I will talk about a sport that most of you probably have never even considered to be a sport and were completely unaware of, and that's called 9-pin bowling. So for anyone who is familiar to bowling, just subtract 1 pin so that instead of 10 you have 9, and this is what you do in Germany, usually. So this is co-authored work with Alexander Straub, my fellow co-worker who unfortunately left academia a couple of months ago. But we really enjoyed working together on this project. And I have to admit, so my biggest failure today is that I don't have my screen that I wanted to have. So the bowling alley where I began with this sport and were also quite engaged for a couple of years. So instead, I put up a beach, at least for some sun. So compared to the talks that I've been following so far, this one is maybe a bit more into labor economics, which is where both of us, my co-author and me, are coming from. So it's essentially about the gender gap And in a nutshell, what we do, so we analyze gender-specific competitive performance against the opposite gender, but in a sport where men and women can compete directly against each other, and this is something where you do not find a lot of data on. We also use an instrument to address the indigeneity of selecting into competing against a certain gender, and we have 3 main findings that I would briefly like to mention before going into more details. So we have 2 countries that we analyzed, the Czech Republic and Austria. The main reasons for doing so being that data is much more available and also more detailed in these 2 countries compared to, for instance, where we started, Germany. So in the Czech Republic, men perform better against women and women perform worse against men, which is something that you might expect if you're familiar with the literature on gender-specific competitive behavior. However, in Austria, we do not find any large gender differences. And the second factor that we look at is whether this attitude towards competition against the opposite sex changes across age. And we find that for both countries, this is not the case. So it seems to be quite stable. So where is all this situated? Well, I probably don't have to tell you that gender gaps are still a persisting problem in today's society. So be it either in terms of mean average wages that you have. So it's about 16.6% if you do not adjust earnings for anything. If you take qualification, tasks, working biographies, such factors into account, we're around 11% in the EU on average. And besides of this monetary factor, men still hold the majority of leading positions or leadership positions. We all know these gender quotas that have been implemented in several countries that address this problem, that somehow also work into the right direction, but it doesn't seem to be that there has been done enough yet. So also, if you consider occupational choices, because often you find different sorting patterns of men and women into certain career paths, even if you take that into account, this cannot fully explain these 11% that still remain. Also from psychology and sociology, you can think about, okay, is there something going on with our evolutionary, let's say, gender roles? So men more the hunter-gatherers, women more being at home, making sure that everything is fine with the children. But then also you can discuss social and biological factors. So for instance, how much of this is really what we see as nature, so embedded in our genes more or less, and how much of this is nurture. So if you go back to the cradle, dressing girls in pink and dressing boys in blue, for instance. So this is kind of where the current discussion is at. And now what is research basically doing? So a big part of this gender gap discussion is now, or has now shifted the focus towards competitive behavior. And I want to briefly introduce you to why that is. So if we look at the labor market and say, okay, we see that men earn more than women on average, why would that be? They have higher positions, they have better positions. So probably how do you get to these better positions? Well, usually you do it through negotiations, right? So even a job talk, like a job interview, is essentially a kind of competition between you and the one who is interviewing you. So you try to convince that person that you are better than your competitors for that job. And similarly, this is the case for any job promotion that you can have. So you always have to show that you're better than your co-workers in order to get, for instance, a promotion to a better paid position. So, and already there, if we consider negotiations, it's quite, or the literature quite agrees on that women tend to do worse in these negotiations. So we have lower female willingness to even enter bargaining games. They then negotiate less high outcomes, so lower outcomes in terms of wages. But largely this is due to the way the environment is shaped. So interestingly, once you inform women, for instance, about how much on average they would get at a position they apply for, they immediately ask for higher wages. But usually we find, or the literature documents that men with a certain amount of overconfidence often have a better standing in terms of positions and wages than women. And so there are different methods to look at these issues. So one very popular one are experiments. So in competitive environments, what you can do is that you have, for instance, set up usually field experiments, but also laboratory experiments where you let people solve certain tasks individually and then in competition with other persons. And then you can see, okay, do male and female performance change when they are under competition and when they are not? And essentially, why do we have to do that even? Maybe that's also worth noting, because usually what I said, these negotiation outcomes in the workplace and in the labor market, there really isn't any data on that. So, I mean, how often does a company really pinpoint down how many people were competing for a job and then who did better performance to get that job? So there's not really that much data on that. So kind of economists, as always, try to find similar environments, and one of them is are experiments. So what experiments have told us so far is that men are more prone to select into competitive environments. So this kind of taste for competition, that they like to measure themselves against other persons. But also that men are less risk averse by doing that and rather overconfident, so also being more or believing more in their own ability. Women, on the other hand, prefer worse when competing against men. This is kind of a standard finding of the literature, but this is somehow moderated if you take into account the stakes. So is it really a high stakes situation where something very important is at stake, or is it just that you sit in a laboratory and you solve, for instance, some mazes against the clock? And then sports econ literature. Yes.
Anna, could I interrupt you? There's a question from Sybil.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, it's more of a comment. So another thing that the experimental literature has shown again and again, that when you match, we are not talking about match yet, like male versus male, female versus female, or female versus male, and so on.
Yes.
So both male and female, they are more hawkish against when they are matched with a female, and more dovish when they are matched with a male. So
yes.
So that also explains it quite a few times when the relative the wage difference or wage gap, because when they are competing, the males are hawkish against females, females are hawkish against females, but male and female both are dovish against males.
Yeah,
I think you can have a look at this Hom 2000 Games and Economic Behavior. I think it started from there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So another big strand that recently started to consider gender issues are sports economics. I don't think I have to convince anybody in the audience that this is a real, true field of literature and of research, and that you can actually do something with sports. So this literature has also come up with some scenarios and some results. So for instance, that confirming this risk taste for men in basketball, so this would be Böheim, but also in chess. Interestingly, men not only take more risks when they hope to get a high payoff from that, but also in situations where it's quite clear that even taking large risks will not pay off. Then also women tend to perform better in a female environment. So if it's a team of purely, or if it's a competition against women, then they perform better. If they are matched again against men, again, they usually experience drops in performance. And also that men tend to choke under pressure, so maybe telling us something about the stakes that there are. This is kind of what the literature, or what the current stand of the literature more or less is. And now you might already ask yourself, why the hell would anybody study line pinballing? So this is our second paper actually using the sport. We started out with using German data, and we have 3 good reasons to believe that looking at a niche sport nobody has heard of and nobody inside Germany would consider a sport, but rather a leisure activity, actually makes sense. So if we look at professional sports, where of course we have great data on competitive behavior, really for our topic it's a bit complicated because professional sports tend to be gender separated. There are some exceptions, so Japanese speedboat racing, chess, even some horse riding competitions, but that's more or less it. So this gender separation is a problem in the sense that men and women may then face different environments, incentives. So how much is at stake in the female version of the tournament? How much is at stake for the in the male tournament, and also how popular are these? So in this sense, if we analyze competitive behavior in these gender separated sports, it's problematic because competitive behavior is not really directly comparable. And also, of course, we do not see this mixed gender competition that would really be something that is in the labor market and that a great foundation. So we need a mixed sport, and now we way men and women directly against each other. Second issue is that professional sports are very representative for the top performers, but not for the average market participant. So, and this is true in terms of taste for competition. So you do not get to the top without really sacrificing years and years of training as a professional, any like soccer, basketball, whatever player. Also, of course, you kind of have to get a very tough competition in order to get to the top. And if we look at the labor market, that would be representative for probably CEOs, but not for the average worker. And even within this average working population, we find this gender difference. So we would have a sport that not only has data on top performers. So, and of course, self-selection into professional sports is a problem. Not everybody selects there, so we have a strong selection on ability, and kind of then drawing conclusions to the general working population might not be too representative. So a non-professional sport would be very nice, but often you only have data on professional sports. Luckily in 9-pin bowling, if they record anything, they are really very meticulous about it. So they write down everything you can imagine, from how many spectators there were. Like, yeah, sometimes spectators come to these games. They write down the temperature in the room. If a person or a player from a team leaves an hour before the actual match is over, which is possible because they are not only all playing at the same time, they even put this into the report. So there's a good data quality for the countries that we concentrate on. A third issue with professional sports are the incentives that there are. So usually you get high monetary rewards. If you think of what a soccer player gets for becoming a part of the national team, of a Champions League team. But these, soccer is probably a very good example. We know that these payoffs differ for male soccer and for female soccer. So you could say, okay, it's again a different environment. So people might be incentivized differently, and it's hard to compare them. And gender differences seem to vary across stakes. There are 2 studies that look into that, and if we think back to what we really want to investigate, so this labor market issue of negotiations, of competition, then really high stakes situations are more rare events. So how often in your life do you get a promotion? Maybe 2 or 3 times, I don't know. And so wage negotiations, of course, yes, if you apply for a job, but all these, like even being on the list for possible people who get the promotion, you kind of have to get on that list, and you usually do so by kind of winning lower stake, let's call it tournaments. So how much effort do you put in a task? If you always deliver very detailed and very successful reports to your supervisor, he might take you into consideration for this short list of likely to get a promotion at some point. So we would argue it would make sense to look at this intrinsic or like more intrinsic motivation to win that is not incentivized by very high monetary rewards. 9-pin bowling is very nice in that sense because even if you're a top player, so playing the equivalent of Bundesliga in Germany, you wouldn't get paid. So it's a pure non-monetary situation. Nevertheless, it's very competitive in the sense that people really put a lot of effort in there, and even at the lower levels, there's some amazing cheering going on during the games and so on. I mean, it's not comparable to big stadiums, but still people really want to win. And finally, so the second big thing that we look at in this paper is the part of age. And why do we do so? Well, we do so because there's research showing that some aspects of personality develop over the life cycle. So, for instance, distributional preferences seem to develop during adolescence. So you would find differences between younger persons and, let's say, grown-ups and older persons. Whereas big five personality traits seem to be stable over the life, and if we think of competitive behavior in terms of taste for competition, maybe that is similar to these personality traits. So for the literature on competition and age, there's mixed evidence. So some find a smaller gender gap for older cohorts. Some find that it doesn't really make a difference. So there are a couple of studies, usually from experimental literature from different countries, so developed countries also. And probably most related to our study, because considering some sport, I mean, it's an online card game, but still you could consider it a sport, is G-War, so they do not really find any significant age effects. Let's now move to the data, I think what everybody is waiting for. So this is how a typical alley of 9-pin bowling looks like. I think one of the biggest features is how the layout is. So you have, it's very representative. You tend to have 4 different lanes. Then you have 2 teams and they compete. Usually there are 4 to 6 players in a team. And even though it's a team game, you have one personal opponent that you compete against with. So these 2 people would compete against each other, saying that, okay, they start on the first lane. Usually you do 30 throws, so 30 times you throw the ball on the pins, and who hits most pins in the end gets what we call a set point, so who wins the set. And after that, they change the lanes, because believe it or not, lanes can be of different qualities. So everybody has to play every single lane in order to make it comparable. And then after that, these 2 go over here and do the same thing here. And the other ones go to the first 2 lanes. So and this is how it usually plays out. These would be, for instance, the first pairing. So as I said, 4 to 6 players on each team. They tend to play in pairs of 2. Like 2 from each team in the first pairing, then you have a second and maybe a third pairing. And after that, you see, okay, who got, if, for instance, the blue guy here wins the first set, then loses the second set, they would be even, they move on here, but then he scores better and gets 2 more set points, and then he would get a team point. So if you are better in total than your direct opponent, you get a team point, and these team points is what you add up in the end to see which team will win. So even though it's a team sport, you have a strong incentive to individually perform at your best and be better than your opponent, because then your team will win. And it's very hard to win if half of the teammates are not at their best performance. So I think that's the most important for, and what is really nice, you can always see how much you score and how much your opponent scored, and also how much the other scored. So in a sense, really it's a setting where you get instant feedback on your performance, and I don't think that happens all the time, that you get so detailed feedback. So you can see immediately, am I 1 pin back behind my opponent? Is it 2 pins? How many throws do we have left? Is it likely that I still keep up? But yeah, That's kind of things that you can observe. Also, very nice in this picture, you can see men and women can compete directly against each other. So I mentioned most of the, so we have, of course, we have a panel dimension in our data, so we consider like 12 years or seasons of 9-pin bowling. This allows us to control for ability, so the baseline bowling ability of each person, which kind of makes sense to take out from our regressions. So we have the pins that we score on each lane. This is how many pins I hit. The point is what you get if you have, or if you hit more pins than your opponent. So it would be equal to kind of winning. And then there's something mistakes. So this is if most people go to bowling, what they do a lot of mistakes. This is when the ball essentially exits the lane and you get 0 pins. This does not happen very often for good players, but still it happens sometimes. So I said you play typically 4 sets, and so they are up to 4 points to be distributed, and the winner then gets the team point. So essentially, our contribution then to the literature is that we have a direct mixed gender competition, we have a less male-dominated sport, and we consider 2 countries with young and old players. And to show you exactly how our data looks like, so these are the 500,000 observations that we have. We have own gender here, opponent's gender here. You see that most encounters are male-male, so 60%. We have 5% female-only encounters, and then around 35 mixed gender encounters. So what I would have to mention here is that we look at different leagues. So we also consider the higher leagues in a country and the lower leagues in a country. And mixed gender competition is what you usually find in the lower leagues. So in the top leagues, they are gender separated, but the lower leagues and medium leagues can be gender mixed. The reason for that is essentially like in history, it wasn't as common today, or in these days, many leagues opened up for mixed gender teams, simply because the sport has passed its most populous days, let's say. So in order to fill up teams, lower and medium leagues now allow for mixed gender teams as well. So we have 5,000 unique players in the Czech Republic and 3,500 in Austria, more or less. And winning probabilities for men are 51%, for women 47%. Obviously, they don't add up because we have more men than women. That's kind of what it looks like. So this is the total data that we have. However, for leagues, so in our regression analysis, we will focus on leagues that allow for mixed gender encounters. So we are down to fewer observations that you will see in a moment. To give you a notion of the age distribution of the players in our data for Austria and for the Czech Republic, there are some differences. So as I said, the sport has passed its most popular days. So many players are between 40 and let's say 70 years old. There's kind of the mass of players around 50. This is true for both countries. However, in the Czech Republic, you have this high spike of younger players who moved into that sport after or around the time that the transition of the Czech Republic happened. So obviously, what is kind of makes sense that in these 20s to 30s you have a drop in players, because what do? Well, they start moving away for jobs, they start founding a family, and so on. This is just so that you have an idea how old are our players. We have people above 80, we have some below 20, and that's kind of the range that we can cover. In terms of estimation, it's not really complicated what we do. We have a baseline OLS estimation where we regress our performance measures. So the pins that we play on the lane, do I win the set or not? And how many mistakes do I do? We regress it on, like, we do it separately for men and women because of the IV strategy that we use later. So we do it even or less separately, and then we regress it in, okay, is it a job opposite gender, which is 1 if yes and 0 if not. And then we have a factor of environmental and ability controls. So environmental controls are dummies. So which pairing are you playing in, which set is it, and are you playing at home? Because obviously you can have a home advantage. People tend to play better in first and last sets than in the medium sets. And yeah, to take that into account, we have these controls. Our ability control includes like your own ability, so it's past ability, like the average of everything that we can observe on a player and the data, the difference to the opponent's ability, and also team ability measures. And then obviously we have an error term. So this is kind of the baseline OLS that we start out with. Obviously, we're most interested in beta 1, and we would expect there to be differences for male and female estimations. However, of course, I said we have these nice individual ability measures, but they might actually not fully capture idiosyncratic differences, right? So if we say that maybe once you start doing a sport, we all know that you start doing some type of performance that is very low. Afterwards, you improve, you get better at the techniques and everything. And actually, this learning curve for performance might be gender specific. Maybe for some reason whatsoever, girls or boys do better than the other gender. And so over time, also panel attrition might differ. I mean, if you're really not very well at a sport, you might be more prone to drop out of that sport. So what we do fixed effects estimation to at least take out these idiosyncratic differences that we cannot otherwise observe. However, this does not really rid our analysis of self-selection. So the thing that we're looking at or focusing on is playing against the opposite gender. And obviously this might be endogenous if players can somehow choose whom they compete against. So when 2 teams meet, there are very strict rules. So until 40 minutes before the game starts, the guest team has to announce the playing order, and then the home team sets the players against that. So players might differ in their preference and say, okay, I don't want to play against the first player because it's a woman. I would rather prefer to play against somebody else. This might happen. So, and then obviously teams might strategically set these players according to the choices that they make. So to account or take that into account, we employ an instrumental variable strategy using the opponent team's female share as an instrument. So obviously, if there are many women on the opponent team, as a man in the home team, you are more likely to play against an opposite sex opponent than if you were a woman. And this is what we exploit to address this self-selection. So again, we do it separately, of course, for men and women. In the first stage, we have opposite gender, which we regress on the ability controls, the environmental controls, and on the female share of the opponent. And then we would expect alpha 1 to be significantly different from 0. So positive, so larger than 0 for men and smaller for women. And then we take this estimated opposite gender, plug it into our second stage, and are interested in beta 1 from this IV. Now we can argue, is it a good instrumental variable strategy or is it not? So the first 2 things that might come to your mind is, okay, can players somehow influence this female share of the opponent team? I mean, obviously it's quite clear they cannot just say, okay, how many women are going to play on the opponent team. But what they could do would be they say, okay, they set many women, or there are many women on the team, I don't want to play today. This is what they could do if they don't want to play against a woman, for instance. However, it's quite unlikely that this is happening because in the leagues that we're looking at, teams are quite small. So if you have 1 substitute player on a game day, that's already a lot. Sometimes very rarely there are 2 substitute players, so you, in case somebody gets injured, but often you do not have any substitute players, so everybody has to play, otherwise you kind of lost that team point already. So the second concern would be, okay, if players cannot really influence the number of women in the opponent team on each match day, can they do it for a whole season? So can players really select according to their preferences into leagues with more or fewer women? As I said before, higher leagues are gender separated. So players, what they could do if they don't want to play, for instance, if they don't want to play against women, they could say, okay, I deliberately want to stay in a lower league and I do not want to qualify for the upper league. And then, of course, I would adjust my performance in the lower league so that it's not good enough to pass to the next best league. Also, this is unlikely to happen because even if you win a league and you're the champion of the league and you're entitled to move to the next higher league, you can always opt for not moving up. You can always say, okay, we prefer to stay in the lower league. A couple of teams really do that because if you move up leagues, you have to drive to, like, the games are at locations farther away. Usually you have home games and away games, and the away games, as you move up in leagues, demand like more traveling time. There were also more costs, and as we said, okay, there's no real sponsoring going on. This could be an issue. So also this is not too likely to happen. But then what about the exclusion restriction? So, right, we talked about, yeah, okay, why might we have a first stage, but what about the exclusion restriction? So econometrically, we would say, okay, the opponent's team female share, which is our instrument, must not have a direct effect on individual performance. So there are 2 concerns to this. If players perceive a team where there are many female players, so the opponent team has a female share of 70%, and they think, okay, this team is going to be weaker because of the many women. And because they have these players, they might have biased perceptions about ability of genders. So this would lead to more confidence in your own winning probabilities. Therefore, and this overconfidence might translate into better performance, actually. So kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy. However, it's not too likely that this is a thing that happens over time constantly, because performance is really easily observable. So both individual performance, like how much did an individual score on a specific game day, and also how did the team perform, is immediately after the game uploaded in online rankings where you can observe all the data. So even if you started out a 9-pin bowling believing, okay, women can't bowl, which you might think, over time you would learn, well, there are women who are really play very well. The second concern to that exclusion restriction might be that players might actually behave differently when they face a team that consists predominantly, let's say, of women. So again, we have 80% women on the team, but the player himself plays against the same-sex opponent, so against the man. Then we cannot really tell whether we cannot really distinguish whether it's competing against a certain same-sex opponent or whether it's really because of the predominantly male or female team. But actually about the same is true in the labor market, so I don't think this would be too much of a concern. So the problem would be if, for instance, because of social norms, as the player might think, okay, it's really a bad thing and socially inconceivable to lose against a predominantly female team. This might harm the player's reputation or self-image, and then the person might exert more effort, even if the opponent is actually of the same sex. In a sense, there's not too much that we can do about it because we cannot distinguish the 2 things, like the sex of the opponent and the average sex distribution of the team. But yeah, we do not think it harms the validity of our results, but we should take it into account once we come to interpretation. Are there any questions to the data so far or to the methodology? Great, then let me convince you once and for all that our instrument works. These are the raw first stage coefficients. So we have the probability of playing against the opposite gender for women score against the percentage of women in the opponent team. So if there are no women in the opponent team, so then obviously we have a high probability of playing against the same gender, and so this reduces as the number of women in the team increases. We have it for Austria, we have it for the Czech Republic. It looks very similar. So we grouped it for the percentages, and yeah, this is essentially what it looks like. So it's a raw first stage that you can see. And then we would move on to the results, where I first give you the OLS results. So we have the 3 different outcomes up here. So we have pins, how much do I score in each lane? Do I win the set or not? So do I get the set point? And we have the mistakes, like how often did I not hit a pin? We estimated separately for women and for men. We have here the coefficient that we're interested in, opposite gender. Here we have the home effect. We have the player pro stability, difference to the opponent in ability, team ability, and opponent team ability. And then we say, okay, we control for position and set, except when we're talking about points, because there this doesn't really matter. You find the numbers of observations here, and I think that's the most important notifications about the table before jumping into the results. So for the Czech Republic, what we see is that women score fewer pins when they are facing a man, whereas men actually perform slightly better. This also translates into lower winning percentages for women and higher winning percentages for men. For the mistakes, men seem to do slightly more mistakes, but it's not mirrored by women doing less mistakes. So there, we wouldn't dive too much into that part of the mistakes. Also because mistakes, as I said, do not happen too often in these settings. So we would focus more on, okay, they perform actually better, and it translates into higher winning probabilities. So that you get a notion, we have the mean of the dependent variable here. On average of the 9 pins that there are, women score 4.0 on a throw and men 4.1. So these differences would be at the range of 0.7 percentage points, and for men it would be around 1% in winning probabilities. So for Austria, there's not that much that is significant. So women seem to perform slightly better against men in terms of pins. So it's a 0.7% increase taken at the average of close to 4. But it does not translate into different winning probabilities. So even though they score slightly more pins, it's not that they are more likely to win the set when they face a man compared to when they face a woman. For men, there is this 10% level significant coefficient indicating that men might be more prone to lose a game when facing a woman. But again, it's 10% and it's not too significant. So, and women seem to do also better in terms of mistakes because they make fewer of them. And it's similar in the fixed effect, so not that much going on. And I would move to AV estimates. So in general, our AV estimates are larger than the OLS estimates in absolute terms. As we said, because we cannot, so if you play against the opposite gender and against a team of the predominantly opposite gender, if both effects go in the same direction, they would of course add up and then kind of make our estimates a bit larger. And yeah, women might be more likely to play against women in Austria then, because there are just more women in that field. But looking at the coefficients or at the estimates that we do get, let's start again with the Czech Republic. Essentially, IV estimates confirm our OLS insights, saying that, okay, women skew fewer pins. They are less likely to win the set, whereas it's the opposite for men. And for Austria, we do not really find that much going on. Women seem to perform a bit better in terms of scoring a higher amount of pins and doing fewer mistakes, but it does not really translate into winning probabilities. So also here confirming our OLS estimates. So now the question is, I mean, I told you we have a quite diverse sample of people aged 20 to 80, and we have this transition in the Czech Republic during the time that these people were alive, so maybe something changed. If we look at the age effects for the Czech Republic, what we plot you here is the opposite gender dummy. For women and for men, the outcome is pins, so how many pins do I score in a lane? Down here it's points, so how likely am I to win the set? And these are separate regressions by age categories, so here we look at people aged 15, here aged 20, and so on. And so the regressions behind these graphs are OLS because the coefficients were smaller than in IV. If we do it with IV, it looks very similar. So we do not really find any age category really driving these effects, but rather, so here you have the 95% confidence intervals. And what we see, okay, women do a bit worse when they face a man, men do a little bit better. Same is true for winning probabilities, but there are not really any age categories drivers. So elder women and elder players and younger players seem to behave similarly when facing the opposite gender. And in Austria, we do also not find that there are any age differences. What does this mean? So first of all, okay, we have no systematic age difference in both countries, suggesting that after childhood, it does not really seem to be relevant which stage of your life you are in for changing your attitude when facing the opposite sex. So no matter whether you are still a student, whether you already gained some working experience, or whether you are already retired, so have lived your life, doesn't really have any impact on the attitude when competing against the opposite sex. Also interesting is that we do not find any structural break around 25 years of age in the Czech Republic, suggesting that the political transition did not seem to have fundamentally changed anything in the perception of the opposite gender or in the competition against the opposite gender. So overall, we would argue that our patterns are stable over the life cycle, and that probably for these diverging results that we find in the Czech Republic and Austria, we could advocate cultural differences as the driver. Does this make sense? Well, if we look at the adjusted gender pay gaps, this is data from 2014, of the two countries. In the Czech Republic adjusted, we have close to 20%, and in Austria we have half of that. So really two countries that even in terms of gender equality are very much apart. And one interesting, I mean, it's illustrative, of course, but I think it really tells a lot about the attitudes towards gender and gender roles in the two countries, comes from the World Value Survey, where there is a statement, men should have more rights to a job than women when these jobs are scarce. And in the Czech Republic, 22%, so 1/5 of the population, or close to 1/4, agrees with the statement, and in Austria it's only 13%. So, and this kind of fits very well to the fact that in Austria we do not really find any differences in terms of competition against the opposite gender between men and women. So we find a similar cultural link than Gnisi and Rusticini and Reber et al. So they have Israel and Sweden, and Israel has a large gender gaps, and boys tend to be more competitive than girls in the experiments, whereas in Sweden, where we have a small gap, children compete more equally in the same task. So overall, we would say that there is some evidence that cultural differences might matter for competing against the opposite gender. And these seem to persist, at least according to our investigation, over generations. And in case I lost you somewhere, here again our three main findings. So in the Czech Republic, men perform better against women, women worse against men. In Austria, men do not perform better against women. There are some slight indications that women might perform slightly better, but it doesn't pay off. And this part for Austria is actually in line with the analysis that we did previously with data from the German county Württemberg. So also there we didn't find really any gender differences. And both results are not, or both patterns are not specific to any age group, and this again is consistent with that online card game analysis I mentioned earlier. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward now to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna Katharina. I'm going to give you a virtual round of applause. So
yeah, it works. Thank you.
Some of the amazing things you can do in Teams. We've got lots of time now for a Q&A. Thank you for what was a really fascinating talk. A very well constructed paper, very fascinating analysis. If anyone has any questions and comments, please do raise your hands and feel able to make them. Stefan.
Hi, that was really, really interesting. Thank you. And I have a couple of questions. So firstly, I think the point you make at the beginning that this is an activity which is it's competitive, but it's not for money. I think that's an important point about it. It's not an elite sport in that sense. But on the other hand, it is also a social activity. And I can imagine that many people might compete in this for other reasons, and those reasons might also be connected to gender. So I don't know if you can comment on this, but I suspect there's dating going on here as well, which could be influencing behavior. And so my question is, is there any way to take account of that issue? And my second question is something about the way in which the whole thing is organized. So I don't know what the structure of organization. No doubt there's a national association for 9-pin bowling with committees and organizations and rules and appeals and disciplinary and all that kind of stuff. And surely isn't all of that, I mean, I would suspect, like as in most sports, these things are dominated by men. And isn't that likely to have some influence on the way in which competition is structured and perhaps the way that men and women behave in competition?
Yeah, thank you. That particularly the second question is something I never really thought about. So there are women's or female representatives in every layer of these organizations. So you would always have explicitly some, like as we have in universities, a diversity person. But actually, are more of them men or women? I would guess they are more men than women. But on the other hand, I wouldn't really know how this would change role models. The way, you couldn't really change the structure of the sport that much. Either you play more pins or you play less pins, and the one who scores more should win. And it's not so. The ones who occupy these posts usually used to play in their youth. At some point, dropped out because of family or health reasons, and then want to continue to contribute something to the sport. And so they move into that, and then I'm not sure whether it's not the case that they're proportionally, I would guess they're proportionally more women represented in these areas than in the whole sport, because women tend to be more into volunteering than men after that certain period. But it's certainly a very interesting thing that I would like to think about more. Yeah, thank you for that idea. Regarding the first point, is there dating going on, and is this the main driver into 9-pin bowling? From what I can tell, if you do 9-pin bowling, it's not that this raises your dating, let's say, points that you have, because it's a niche sport, and obviously, yeah, I guess you're more attractive if you do a sport that really is considered a sport, also by your fellow members. For the people within that sport, I mean, to some extent, at least for the young, so at least for teens, it is true that if your friends play the sport and you form a team together, it makes you more likely to stay than if all of them quit. That is true, but I don't think this differs for gender, across gender. So, yeah, but thank you for these two insights.
Thanks, Stefan. Anna, I'm going to ask you to unshare your screen, just because it means that as you share it right now, I've got a very big picture of me facing myself. So. Perfect.
Did it? Yeah.
Yep. No, that's good. Any more questions and comments? Well, there's a dearth of comments, which must reflect how comprehensively presented your paper was. Nope, sorry, Thomas has got his hand up.
Yes, hi. So I didn't, maybe I missed it in your literature review, but there was a paper by Ignacio and some others in Reade forthcoming using chess players to look at gender differences. So I don't know if you mentioned that or not, but if you haven't, maybe you can take a look at that. I was going to send it as a text comment.
Yeah, so who were the authors?
One of them is Ignacio Palacios Huerta. I don't know the other two.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm not sure whether we know the most. If it's just come out, we haven't considered it, but the name is familiar, and yeah, we have looked at that. Yeah,
it's so. But I was looking at the website yesterday, and it was in the forthcoming paper, so it's super recent. But
okay, yeah, probably that we are unaware. But thank you for pointing that one out. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Whilst on chess, I may have missed this as well. When you rank the ability of players, is there a system by which it's ranked within the 9-pin bowling, or do you use a system like ELO ratings or something like that?
Like when we rate our ability measures or the rankings of the league?
Yeah, no, I was just kind of wondering, because you had something about the ability of the players, and presumably that's different from the ability.
Yeah, so we control that in terms of past performance. Past performance is available because it's a panel, and we observe players over some years, and so we take that past. I mean, we played around with it, right? So we did past ability, we did past and future, we did every ability we could find about the player. It's not, the analysis is not sensitive to what type of ability constructor we use. Was that your question?
Sort of. Stefan's got a question, so I'll let him ask.
Yeah, sorry. I just wonder. One thing that struck me is, of course, Austria and the Czech Republic are on the border each other. So, is it possible to say anything about whether these results start to merge as you get closer to the borders? Do you know where they're playing, and could you say whether on the just to the other side of the Czech border, they're a bit more Austrian and vice versa.
We could do that because we know the location of the clubs, and so we could look into that. I don't know how much observations we would have left, but certainly we could do some east-west analysis within both countries. Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you. Maybe there's something going on.
Thanks, Stefan.
Well, so I mean, just to follow up, I mean, I wonder what other controls. Yeah, I mean, you've got so many observations. I mean, it's not, you're not exactly short of observations. It seems to me like there are possibly other dimensions on which dimensions of difference that you could perhaps capture. I mean, are there, for example, are there time, if you know the dates when they've been played, are there time of year effects?
Yes, we do. So yeah, we could look more into, is it the initial, like the beginning of the season, is it the end of the season? That would be something that we could, and what we tried to do, or what we actually did, but we didn't find it that much, is to look at whether matches it's or not. So the first set, the last set, because obviously if you're the last player on the team, it's very different what you do for winning and losing. We didn't really find any differences there, but yeah, across the season, we could certainly look at that, I guess. Yeah.
Are these teams, are they part of the multi-sports clubs, or are they independent teams? Or I mean, is that a thing?
I would guess that most of them are independent for historical reasons. So historically, bowling became popular in Europe in the, in the 70s. And local towns, just like my insignificant town of 20,000 populations, founded a bowling club that are usually not, and sometimes in some cases they are related to the general sports association that they have in the town, but mostly they are independent.
So
would that make?
Sorry.
No, would that make? What's your line of thought? Would it make a difference?
Yeah, I would think that the social environment of a multi-sports club would have an impact on the way that this would work. So I would think that would be important. I mean, the other thing that immediately sort of comes to mind is the urban-rural distinction. Attitudes.
Thank you. Yes.
Men tend to be different, right, in cities than they are in rural areas, and so that might be something you could capture as well.
That's what I wanted to do very much. Opposed by my co-author, who didn't really believe it, didn't follow it up for this paper. So yeah, but I might get back to it, even with the suggestion of close to the border, farther off the border. That would be another dimension to it into, yeah. I mean, I have to add, though, that especially in, like, obviously in the capitals, a lot of that is played in the capitals. So in Vienna alone, there are like 6 different leagues on virtually the same ability level. But yeah, there is more that.
Yeah, and of course Vienna's close to the border anyway, right? So that could interfere with that relationship, I guess. But
that might. But I would just have to get better at the geography of Austria and the Czech Republic too.
Well, you should do a tour and go and interview all of these teams and ask them what their attitude and why they're behaving that way. Because I always think that, you know, it's an interesting question to say, as econometricians, you know, we identify these relationships, and we tend to believe that the data tells us what the real truth is about what's going on. But what people say and think must matter to some extent as well, right? And, you know, even if, yeah.
Certainly, yeah. So I mean, we already learned a lot about local geography in the 2 countries, and sometimes it's funny how different data protection works in countries. So for some players, we didn't like, some names could be male or female, so we had to Google and Facebook people, and that was easier to find out these days than it would have been like 20 years ago. So.
Thanks, Stefan. Any more questions and comments? You mentioned that the sport took over in the 1970s. And your data begins in, is it 2006? Is that just because that's online, or
that's because of availability?
Because you mentioned that they're very meticulous about how they record all these aspects of the game. So I guess what are the older games all just written in notebooks somewhere or something rather than online?
So usually they have been written paper and pencil. In the section of bowling that I attended, they are still paper and pencil. This one is another section because they are different lanes. For technical reasons, my lanes are made out of wood. The lanes we are looking at in the analysis are made out of what you use for the streets. So it's and they are the most advanced because they have the largest bowling, like the largest part of the population. So they at some point they switched to using technology. And yeah, before that, paper, pencil, and yeah, it's unfortunately impossible to get anything earlier than that.
Yeah, yeah. More questions and comments? The only thing that I was quite interested in was your proportions of male versus female, male, female, and so on. Are they relatively constant over the 12 years, or do they fluctuate at all?
It doesn't fluctuate too much. I mean, if we looked at a larger time frame of 20 years, I would guess that would be the case. But for the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, not too much change in that sport. I don't think so.
Okay, so a final call for questions and comments. Okay, well, thank you very much, Anna Katharina. That was a really fascinating talk, a really well-constructed study with some really interesting results. And I obviously wish you well with the paper as it develops and as you consider further avenues within it. We will return again next week when we have Karina Steckenleiter from the University of St. Gallen presenting Do Local Public Expenditures on Sports Facilities Affect Sport Participation in Germany. So thank you very much again, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Anna Katharina, and I wish you all a good weekend and hope to see you all again this time next week.